All right. Thanks for tuning in for another conversation from Veterans for All Voters, our new brand, where we talk to thought leaders in the election reform movement and adjacent spaces to kind of get smart, stay inspired about the work that we're doing. So thanks to all the veterans, military folks tuning in, and those friends as well. Really excited to host this conversation with my friend, Jeff Clements, who's the founder and CEO of American Promise, which is a organization with a bold but achievable, as Jeff will explain, strategy to implement a constitutional amendment to address money in politics, which is a pervasive issue, overwhelming support from both political parties to address the issue, but seemingly difficult. So we're going to get into the conversation. But Jeff, thanks so much for joining. Welcome. And if you can, just tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got interested in this issue of money in politics.
Well, thank you, Todd. I sure will. And congratulations to you and Eric and everyone over at the newly named Veterans for All Voters. It's a great name, and it's what you've been doing already. Just fantastic work. And it's been a pleasure to work with you guys. So at American Promise, as you said, we're really tackling one of the biggest problems in our democracy, the systemic corruption of money in the political system. I didn't set out, like a lot of us, I think, in the reform work, did not set out to do this. I'm a lawyer by background. I practiced law in Boston at a big firm as a partner there and served in the Attorney General's office. I was chief of the Public Protection Bureau there. I ended up being asked to do a brief when I was returning to private practice in the Supreme Court in a case known as Citizens United, which is now a well-known case because it struck down the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. It was not the only case. It's the most famous for sort of opening the floodgates to unlimited money in politics. But it's really been a growing problem for about 40 years around the Supreme Court's interpretation that spending money in politics is a First Amendment right of free speech. And the courts wrestled with that for a long time. In the past decade or so, the court has just thrown up its hands and said, basically very little anti-corruption law can stand, and money in politics is free speech, and we're not allowed to limit it. So I came to this, in answer to your question, as a lawyer, very concerned that the Constitution had just been rewritten, basically, without the participation of the American people. We've had anti-corruption laws for 200 years. The Supreme Court never had this theory about free speech. The first 200 years of American history, they had not taken one case in all that time. Nobody even argued that the Supreme Court took seriously that spending money to influence the outcome of an election is a free speech right. It's basically a product of the 1970s activist court creating theories that they thought would work, and some of them didn't. But we've had anti-corruption laws the whole time. Teddy Roosevelt was very active in passing laws limiting money in politics. States have done it for over a century. So to me, it was like a fundamental problem that I thought would end badly. And now this is going back 10 years. I'm still practicing law. I go out to Montana to help Steve Bullock. He was the Attorney General at the time out there. And I knew him from the Attorney General days. And he was defending Montana's laws after the Citizens United case. He said, we've limited money in politics for a century now in Montana. It's how we wrestled back from the robber barons in the Gilded Age and the mining companies any semblance of democracy and self-government in Montana at all. And as a result of these limits, we have a citizen legislature. The average cost, he told me, was about $17,000 for a state election race and to get it into the state legislature. Low cost. They knew their voters. They talked to their voters. There was no outside big money because of these laws. So he said, we got to defend this. And, whatever the bipartisan federal law was, that shouldn't change state laws that have stood for a century. So I went out there to help him defend the Montana law. And we won in the Montana Supreme Court 8-1. It went up to the Supreme Court of the United States. They didn't even give the state a hearing. And 25 other states had laws just like this. The court summarily reversed, which is lawyer speak for didn't even respect the Supreme Court of Montana or the attorneys general of these 25 states enough to even let them make the argument. They struck down all those laws. And So what happened is we now have $20 billion elections, $500 million Senate races. We got super PACs, dark money. We have foreign governments who've spent $100 million through foreign government-owned corporations in Maine alone. And maybe we can talk a bit more about what's going on in Maine later on. But it's been an absolute catastrophe as a theory. It's wrong on the Constitution. And it's how I got into it, to answer your question. I started as a lawyer and ended up running a nonprofit that's national, nonpartisan, and on our way to amending the Constitution, just like you are doing what you're doing, and so many good people I've seen, where Americans are looking around and saying, this is crazy. This is not sustainable. This is not putting the country first, and stepping in and trying to figure out what can we bring to it. So that's what I can bring to it. It's American Promise has great success so far, and it's been a real privilege to work with so many Americans across all political lines who agree. And it's a super majority, vast majority of Americans who think we got to fix this. And so it's been a real pleasure.
I was unaware of, I have seen Citizens United. I was unaware of the implications that states that had laws governing money in politics and appropriate restrictions and therewithal. I was not aware that Supreme Court decisions had summarily undone state actions in this matter. So how do we, I do want to let me ask a question on the policy, and then we can get into sort of a little bit of the politics about how you think that we change this. But what is public opinion when it comes to money in politics? I am going to assume it's, we think that there's too much of it. But talk to us a little bit about public opinion on the issue itself. Has that changed over time? Has the issue gotten worse? And then to I'd like to hear from your perspective too, like what is an appropriate role for money in politics? So talk to us a little bit more about what is the appropriate role of money in politics, what are attitudes about money in politics, where is it being appropriately used, misappropriately used?
Yeah, I'm gonna start with the polling and what we know about what Americans think, because in my view, the appropriate approach is what Americans think is the appropriate approach. It's not what I think, it's not what you think. It's whether or not the core constitutional question we have before us in this country on the systemic corruption of money in politics is, do Americans have the right to decide for ourselves together as a democracy what the appropriate limits on how money is used to influence election outcomes? We used to. Every democratic society in the world does, because you can't protect a republic without checks against concentrated forces of money, whether it's foreign money or global corporate money or big union money or billionaire money. It's not because people are bad. It's because, like the founders of the Constitution knew, that people are human, and when you have power, you seek to use it, and you think you're doing a good job at using it. But if you have a lot more power than everybody else, you're going to use it in ways that end up hurting people. So in my view, the question is, what do Americans think is the appropriate role? And I can tell you that, and so can the amazing polls we're seeing, and I'll share that with you, because they're amazing for a lot of reasons. One is there is virtually no difference between how Republicans think about it and how Democrats think about it and how independents think about it. Let me unpack that a little bit. This is all recent. We have various surveys and polls over the last 6 months, and it hasn't really changed that much. It's been steady, but the numbers are now getting very intense. So here's a couple. 7 out of 10 Americans think our democracy is under dire threat, and that's a general problem, not just money in politics. The question is, I'll be happy to share the links with you, Todd. This is basically CBS News and a polling firm they used. 7 out of 10 Americans think American democracy is under dire threat, but they dug deeper. They said, why? What are the reasons you think our democracy is threatened? Number one, money in politics. Not election denialism, not political violence and division, not lots of things. They're on there. They're on the list. Far and away, though, the number one reason, money in politics. And the crosstabs, as the pollsters say, that digging a little deeper about are there differences in different demographics. 86% of Republicans said that the number one threat to our democracy is money in politics, and 86% of Democrats said that. And independents the same. It's basically this straight line in terms of what is causing our sort of unraveling in America. And I think that's what it is. I think people get it, that it's, you know, it's not the abstract campaign finance kind of wonky issue. It's the systemic impacts of corruption and Americans losing voice and losing representation, and how that plays out. I don't think this means necessarily that suddenly, you know, 4 out of 5 Americans are campaign finance nerds. You know, what it means is that Americans are smart. They understand what's happening here, which is that power has concentrated in a tiny, tiny slice of donor class, and it's having systemic effects that make us ungovernable and alienating most Americans from our government and our representatives, and from each other. So that's a really interesting number. A Pew survey, also very recent. Again, I'll share the links. A Pew survey showed, you know, they've ranked for years and years and years. What are the top priorities for Americans that Congress and the president and our representatives should be solving? And, you know, the economy is always at the top. War and peace is right up there. This has never happened before, Todd. Reducing money in politics, top 5 issue. It's now number 4. Ahead of immigration, ahead of crime, ahead of budget deficits, ahead of very serious problems. Again, people get, this is not sort of like a luxury that it would be nice if we dealt with money in politics. Americans are saying we have to. Now, 2 more polls that we've done recently. Citizen Data, you may work with them too. Our friends Mindy Finn and the Citizen Data Group, very nonpartisan, effective polling survey firm. Again, showing the priority of this issue of money in politics to Americans, but before asking them any questions to kind of, you know, warm them up, we asked first whether they support a constitutional amendment to enable Americans to enact limits on how money is used to influence elections. 3 out of 4, 75% plus. Again, very little difference between Republicans, Democrats, and independents. So there's this massive consensus, Todd, among the American people. This is a dire threat, a serious problem. There is a solution. We know what to do. It's going to take a constitutional amendment because the Supreme Court got us into this mess, and we need to get on it. So that's the good news. And now it's up to us. I think Americans are ready to do this.
It's so inspiring, and then in equal measure infuriating that there can be such a consensus among the American people who genuinely want to do the right thing, see the government move forward, and then the barriers that exist towards that happening, whether it's an ideological Supreme Court or the resistance to limiting money in politics. Let me ask you a question. Let's get into the politics of this and what you see as being the path forward. So wide consensus among the American people, this is an issue, it needs to be addressed. They view it as an existential threat to our democracy, which I would agree with. You'll never hear a politician stand up and defend money in politics. So who is against, like, what are the forces against this? If you don't see, at least I don't see, maybe you do, I don't see like sort of an organized and vocalized opposition saying, hey, more money in politics is a better thing. So where is the opposition? Help us understand that. And then what do you see as the path forward for a constitutional amendment?
Yeah, great questions. And so, you know, you used to see vocal support for the theory that money in politics is free speech. And I think that's interesting. There used to actually be a debate about it before we tried it, right? So back before Citizens United, there were people who were happy to argue that we have to remove the limits on money in politics to give Americans more voice. They essentially said that somehow, you know, I personally, I didn't know anyone who felt like they were silenced by anti-corruption laws. But there were arguments. And so there are still some who think that. They don't tend to be as vocal as they used to be because the argument is so clearly failed. But, you know, I respect the Supreme Court. I've practiced law for decades, and they're smart people. And I credit them with, the majority of the court who thought that the First Amendment meant that government should not limit the spending of money to influence elections. I think it's absolutely wrong, but there's different views even among the smartest lawyers in the world, and some of those smartest lawyers in the world are on the Supreme Court, but they're wrong, I think, and it's now been proven. So we don't need to really debate the theory. It is clear that limits on money in politics actually protects the voice of most Americans, the voter. It protects free speech for everybody. It protects anti-corruption. It stops corruption of our political system. There's all kinds of good reasons for it, and nobody is really threatened by their free speech by having laws that apply to everybody. If a billionaire wants to argue that they have a right to spend $100 million in elections, they're free to make that argument. I think most Americans reject that and say, no, you have a right to spend $100 million to go to Mars if you want. Do whatever you want with your money. Nobody's saying you can't. What you can't do is take something that belongs to everybody else, and that's our political system. So, but there are those who do that, and we've had debates with them who make the argument that it is actually free speech. We've won those debates overwhelmingly. One was at the Constitution Center in Philadelphia. So there's a small segment of people who intellectually are in favor of what we're seeing now. That's fine. We win that debate. The more ominous opposition, I think, is we now have taught something that's never existed in American history. It's a multi-billion-dollar political industrial complex of operatives, super PACs, media companies. People are making a lot of money in the system. Much of it goes to tearing Americans apart and sort of the outrage industry. But every campaign cycle, now it's getting to school committee and DA's races and everything else. But of course, the big federal races too. That's a massive concentrated power that, and in, historical human terms, people don't tend to surrender power very willingly or easily. And that's what we're asking people to do. So that's the bigger opposition. And that's why you don't see it, because they want to work behind the scenes. They want to try to stop us. But the good news is we can handle it. We know how to win. We know how to do this. And the opposition that we face today, and this is really important for us to understand, I think, as Americans, and it applies not just to our work at American Promise, but I think yours at Veterans for All Voters and all of our cohorts in the reform space, is we have challenges, but they're not different in kind or degree than the challenges of our grandparents or great-grandparents in similar issues. I mean, if you look at how things looked 100 years ago, when the Senate was basically owned by the robber baron corporations, as they called them, and we had massive division and political violence and a pandemic and global war and all kinds of problems. We did 4 constitutional amendments in the space of a decade and massive reform, and set us up for the American century. So, we have to recognize that, yeah, sure, we have obstacles, but we also know how to overcome them.
And you've laid this out in ways that I find really inspiring, because you captivate, I think, the imagination with what is possible, building on our history of how we ushered in a progressive reform era with constitutional amendments. So what is the path forward? How does this practically happen, particularly because most of us have no mental model that a constitutional amendment is even viable? Talk to us about the path that you see as being possible here.
Yeah. Well, a lot of us don't have the mental model because we haven't done it very recently, but that's also normal. So just for the civics refresher, we, the people, have the right and the ability to amend the Constitution. It's under Article 5 of the Constitution. It's how we've done all 27 amendments to the Constitution so far. And those are big deals. Like the Bill of Rights were amendments, women voting, the reason we elect senators, the elimination of the poll tax that was barring so many Americans from voting, things like that. All of those were amendments. And so how it happens, the technical way, there's a way in there that calls for a convention. We're not doing that. It's never been done. Every single amendment we've got in this country has been 2/3 vote of Congress to propose the amendment, and then ratification in 3/4 of the states, and it's part of the Constitution. So that's 290 votes in the House, 67 in the Senate, 238 state legislatures, ratifying it, it's done. Okay, so it's a numbers, just like any other challenge. I said the reason we haven't done it is because we're not, the mental model isn't there, is because we haven't done it in a while, is normal. And I want to just say something about that. Almost like clockwork in this country, Todd, from the revolution forward, about every 50 years, we go into what I call an amendment era. So, it was 50, we did the Bill of Rights after the revolution. That was really important to set up the Constitution as the American people wanted, including enumerated rights of the citizens spelled out. 50 years later, we hit the Civil War and we do the Civil War amendments. And it's 50 plus or minus, it's roughly, but it's about every half century. 50 years after that, we go into the meltdown of sort of the Gilded Age and a lot of challenges to the country. And we come into another amendment era, 4 amendments between 1913 and 1920. 50 years after that, 4 amendments between 1961 and 1971. We sometimes forget that. I mean, there's plenty of people alive right now, Americans who participated in passing and ratifying constitutional amendments. We did 4 of them in the 60s. So now here we are 50 years later, things are melting down again, and we're doing the same thing, I think. We're going to see, I think, some other amendments too, probably term limits, fiscal responsibility, things like that. But, our focus is on dealing with the existential issue of whether we, the people, will be represented, or the money in politics is going to destroy the integrity of elections. So we know how to do this. It's been done before. What American Promise is doing is following the same strategy for all successful amendments. It doesn't start in Congress. They'll be the last to come along. It starts in the states. So we have 22 state wins. We do state campaigns. We do state. It's how we educate each other about how to do this. We rack up support in the states, 22 victories so far. We're on the ballot in Maine. Maine voters will decide, do we back this amendment or not? Do we want to keep foreign money out of Maine's elections or not on November 7th? Thank you to Veterans for All Voters for endorsing and supporting that effort in Maine. But 22 states have now done that so far. And we leverage that support and the support of cities, towns, counties, you name it. It's a real civic exercise. And we take that to Congress, and we take it to specific representatives and senators who are so their voters who actually vote for them and support them, whether they're Republican, Democrat, and Independent. The conversations are among friends and supporters who are insisting, we need you to vote for this amendment. And so that's what's happening. We're over 200 votes in the House. We're at 50 in the Senate. The key now is getting Republicans and Democrats to vote together in Congress on this. We're working on that strategy, talking with Republicans about introducing their own version of the amendment. We'll bring them together. We'll get our 290 votes and 67 in the Senate. And we're looking at about 2 years on from that. That's sort of our 24, 26 push. We're racking up more state wins, and we call those ready to ratify. And that's really important, that when Congress votes, it goes back to states that are well informed, that want to ratify it and are ready to go, and we get quick ratification. So we didn't invent the process. The beauty of it is it engages all Americans, and it actually unites us. The process is pretty important too. It brings us together to get it done. And it brings lasting, permanent change. The Supreme Court has no role in it. 8 of our amendments corrected Supreme Court decisions. The Supreme Court accepts the last word of the American people on what the Constitution means, and that's the opportunity we have now.
Jeff, how do people get engaged with you and join the effort? What can they do?
Well, go to AmericanPromise.net, number 1. So American Promise, all one word, AmericanPromise.net, and sign up. And then you'll put in some information. We won't barrage you with emails, I promise, but you'll be able to be connected with the work in your state. You'll be able